this week we're going to talk about the resurrection the same way a scholar would talk about a resurrection. So someone who has their PhD in New Testament studies, what do they talk about when they talk about the resurrection? And so the first thing to keep in mind, and this is dovetailing into what we talked about last week, is that scholars agree that most, and see how I highlighted that most of the New Testament is a set of authentic writings from the first century. Okay, and what do I mean by that? So most of the New Testament, we know who wrote it. So if we know who wrote it, they count that as authentic. We can confirm those people existed from other sources. So we have other sources in history that can confirm that the people who wrote those books existed. Okay, so these are the definitions that scholars use to say this is authentic writing. Next, we know when they wrote it. We know dates and times, and we can ascertain dates and time, dates when they wrote it and where they wrote it. We can verify people and places in the writing. So this is something that's important. So what historians have done is looked at, there's places in the New Testament where the writer will say, oh, and the governor at this point is so-and-so. Well, they've gone and looked up and found tablets and writings from other sources, and was really that person a governor, and were they a governor of that location, and were they a governor during that time? Okay. And so these are the writings of the New Testament that a scholar would deem are authentic. The Gospels, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, and 1st Thessalonians. Okay, so if you notice, most of it would be Paul's writings. Okay, so Paul, because he was a Roman person and he included a lot of local details in his writings, we can ascertain, we know who Paul is, and we know when he wrote what he wrote. Okay, and I included here a picture of first century New Testament. This is what it would look like. We talked about this last week. So sometimes you'll be talking to someone and they'll say, well, yeah, but don't mention the Bible when you're trying to talk to me about did Jesus rise, okay? And that's something we need to ask them questions about to get that out of their mind. So you can say, well, just because we put it together and bound it, that's why you don't like the Bible? Okay, scholars use the books in the Bible because they are authentic. They use these criteria to decide if something is authentic or not authentic. Okay? And we talked about last week when we looked at the Bible and how many copies of the Bible exist from the 1st and 2nd century. Okay? So they use that information to say this is authentic. Now what they don't do is they don't say this is inspired, this is from God, this is holy. Okay, so we're not talking about that today. We are saying that the New Testament writings are authentic, meaning we know who wrote it, we know when they wrote it, we know they were real people, it's been authenticated as this is a real person who existed in time and wrote this down. Okay, so we're not going to look at it like, okay, this is inspired by God, this is the Word of God. That's not how scholars look at the New Testament. They say this is an authentic first century writing. So let's take a look at an authentic first century writing. Okay. This is from 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8. And actually, before I read it, I'm going to play you a short video. This guy, Dr. Gary Habermas, he's considered one of the leading scholars on the resurrection. He did his PhD dissertation on this specific topic.
Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 begins like this. He tells the Corinthians, he says, when I came to Corinth, I preached the gospel message to you. And basically, now I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically says, what you do with this message determines where you spend eternity. That's the first two verses. I preached the gospel. Where are you? Well, how did you respond to my message? Did you say yea or nay? And then in the third verse, he said, this is the message that I preached when I came to Corinth. He said, I gave you what I was given. It's extremely important in the recent discussions. I gave you what I was given. Paul was basically saying, I'm doing what any good professor does. I'm passing material on to you that I was taught as reliable material. Is it reliable? Well, we'll have to see. But Paul thought it was reliable. And Paul said, I gave you what I was given. Okay. And what is it? Well, then he talks like this. Verse 3. I gave you what I was given, how that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, and rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and appeared. And then Paul gives a list of appearances. 3 to individuals. He adds himself to the end of the list. So there's Peter, who starts the list, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul says, last of all, me. And 3 groups. A group called the 12, a group of 500, and it says 500 of the brothers. There's a lot of discussion about this, but Paul could mean 500 men. Just like the feeding of the 5,000 is 5,000 men, there could have been 10,000 people there. So when Jesus appears to 500 brothers, if he means to only count them, there could have been 1,000 people there. And the last group, a group called to all the apostles. 3 groups, 3 individuals, Paul says he appeared. But that phrase, I gave you what I was given, as of first importance, this is the center of our faith. I gave this to you as of first importance. That's an extremely crucial phrase, because if there's a unanimous conclusion in the New Testament today, and 1 Corinthians 15 may be the most discussed passage in the New Testament, it could be. Here's a conclusion that virtually every scholar who writes, I don't care how far to the right, I don't care how far to the left, I don't care where they teach, what their credentials, virtually everyone will agree with this phrase. We can tell that this passage, 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, is an early creedal tradition. Now there are synonyms for creed. Tradition, confession. It's an early creedal report. There are dozens of them in the New Testament. And this is one of the most important things that's emerged in the last 40 years. That in the New Testament, there are a number of these early reports, and what they reflect is the earliest preaching of the apostolic community. Bart Ehrman, again, best known skeptic in America, and specialist, Bart Ehrman says, we can trace this material to 1 year after the cross. Now, if you do history, and again, I had to satisfy.
We'll stop it there. So what we're going to look at is what Dr. Gary Habermas talks about as the most talked about passage in the New Testament, and we're going to talk about why it is, and how a historian would look at this passage, and then look at how that affects the resurrection. So the first thing we want to look at is I've highlighted some specific parts of the passage. So the first thing is, he said, I preached to you unless you believed in vain. Okay, that's the first section. So what he's talking about is, hey, if this isn't true, if the resurrection is not true, then you can ignore Christianity. Okay? So this is totally different than the other religions we looked at. This Paul is making the claim that when you decide to be a Christian, you should look at the evidence. You shouldn't take it on blind faith. You should examine the evidence. Okay? And he's saying, what is the evidence, and is this important? Yes, he says this is of first importance. Okay? And Dr. Gary Habermas goes on to talk to you about a creed, and this middle section of the creed in the original language is, think of it like the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance is a creed that's in a specific stanza format. When you say the pledge, everybody pauses at the same spot. Everybody says it the same way. We all know when to pause and when to say it. Okay, that's what he's talking about. It's in a specific format. Da 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 da. Okay, so it is in a creedal format. It's stylized. Okay, and this creed covers the central concept of Christianity. Okay, number 1, that Christ died. Number 2, that he was buried. Number 3, that he was raised. And number 4 is that he appeared. And then as part of Paul's proof elements, he lists 3 people and 3 groups that you could go talk to and make a decision for yourself. Cephas, that's Peter, that's his real name. I don't know why sometimes Bible translators just decide we're not translating that word. That's Peter. Then to the 12, then he appeared to 500, and Dr. Habermas talked about, well, that could be just 500 men. And then he appeared to James, Jesus' brother, and then to all the apostles, and last he appeared to me. So he lists out people that you can talk to. Okay, so I highlighted in blue the groups of people, the 12, the 500 brethren, and the apostles. And then in the purple, the specific people, Peter, James, and to Paul himself. Okay, so how does a historian look at this data and say, well, this concept that Jesus was the Messiah Christ, that he died, was raised, and appeared, isn't a legendary thing, isn't something that grew up 200 years after he died, and we put, rocket packs on his back, and we turned it into a legend. Okay? So how do historians look at this and say, well, this is not a legendary development. This is what they believed from the beginning. So the first thing is that what they do is they look at a timeline. So the first thing that we know, and I have all of these as approximate, so when you look back 2,000 years in history, to get something within a 1 to 2 year window, that's pretty good. So all of these dates are going to be within a 1 to 3 year plus or minus window. Okay, but most people, when they talk about it for round numbers, they say Jesus died in 30 AD. Then Paul saw Jesus on the road, and he went into Damascus, and then if you put these timelines together, so Acts 9 tells the story of him seeing the risen Jesus and going into Damascus, and Galatians 1 is where Paul tells the rest of the story, where he says, after I was in Damascus, I had just been murdering and slaughtering Christians. I couldn't very well cruise into Jerusalem and be like, hey, JK, let's be buds now. So he goes to Arabia and spends 3 years in Arabia. Okay? So we have 2 years after the cross, he sees Jesus, and then he goes 3 years into Arabia. That puts us right around 36 AD. And Paul continues the story in Galatians. Then he says, I went to Jerusalem for 15 days to talk to Peter and James. What do you think they talked about? The weather? No, I think they talked about the one thing they all had in common. They were the 3 people that Paul singled out as seeing Jesus one-on-one. So I think it was something like, what did he look like? What did you see? What did he say to you? What was your experience? And I always remember if you're a sci-fi person, you have seen these Star Trek movies. There's in the Star Trek movies, I don't remember which one, I think it's number 3, where Spock dies and he comes back, and Bones the doctor keeps saying, what was it like? What was it like? What was it like? And Spock says, I can't talk to you about it because we have no frame of reference. Okay? I can't say what it was like because you didn't do it. Well, these are 3 people who had the same experience. They had a similar frame of reference, and this is what they talked about. Okay? So most scholars believe that the creed was given to Paul somewhere between 32 and 36 AD. That's where he got the creed. Okay? So we're talking at most 6 years after the death. Okay? That's not long enough for a legend. Too many people are still alive that could witness it. Now, what scholars actually take it farther back is because they say, well, in order for something to get into a creedal format, that takes some time, okay? It takes some time. So the actual belief system around the creed was immediately after Jesus appeared, immediately after the concept of Christianity being he died, buried, raised, and appeared was immediately after, okay? The next interesting thing is that when you read on in Galatians 2, Paul then tells us that he went back to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and James. And he was doing a checkup. He was saying, hey, for 15 years, I've been out preaching my little tail off and writing like nobody's business. Let's double check What have you been saying it? How have you been saying it? And this is how I've been saying it. What are your sermon notes and what are my sermon notes? And this is how I address grace and faith, and this is what I've been saying. What have you been saying? Okay? And if you want to know, we don't have a whole lot of letters from James. There's one book from James. We don't have much from Peter. Most of what we have from Paul. Well, if you want to know what they would have wrote, Paul tells you. He said, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running or had not been running my race in vain, meaning I want to make sure I wasn't making a bunch of mistakes here. And then he went on to say, they added nothing to my message. So that means if you want to know what Peter was preaching, just read what Paul was preaching. If you want to know what James was preaching, just read what Paul was preaching. They were preaching the same thing. And they had two separate checkpoints. They had one 6 years after the cross and one about 20 years after the cross where they were double checking each other. What were you saying? How did you phrase it? When you were in Corinth, what did you preach? What have you been experiencing? The next thing we can do is look at 1 Corinthians. And so the interesting thing in 1 Corinthians is he went to Corinth and then he wrote 1 Corinthians. And we know that from the verse because it says, I'm writing down what I said to you the last time I was there. Okay, so we know that somewhere around 51 AD, Paul was in Corinth. And then somewhere around 55 AD is when he actually wrote a letter back to them. And in 1 Corinthians, he said, hey, I was there before, and this is what we talked about, and I'm reminding you what I said. I'm writing down what I said to you live. And Dr. Habermas actually goes through that most scholars believe that when Paul visited Corinth, this 51-52 date is the most positive date that they have because Paul mentions who was the governor at the time, and they've unearthed a list of governors that was etched in stone and found this guy's name on it with the dates. So Paul said this guy was the governor, and we found the dates of when the governors were, so we know when Paul was there. Okay, so this is how critical... Now, notice none of this is talking about Christ is the Messiah. None of this is talking about Jesus is Lord. This is how scholars look at first century text, is they piece these texts together to form a timeline, and the timeline that they're forming says logically, this creedal concept is not legend. Okay? So if you get lost into an internet web verse, or someone might come up to you and say, well, the Jesus being the Messiah was just a legend based on pagan belief system. Okay, there was a documentary video that was put out in 2016 that tried to list all of the connections between pagan gods and Jesus, and most of them were ridiculous. Like, hey, this pagan god was born on December 25th, and so was Jesus. No one thinks Jesus was born on December 25th. Rome chose December 25th because the pagan gods were born on December 25th. They kept the dates the same. No one thinks Jesus was born on December 25th. That's no one who does critical scholarship thinks that. The concept of rising again, they say, well, this pagan god rose again. Well, no one rose again into bodily format. Okay, there's times where they chanted and the body came alive for a period of time, mostly so that they could have sex with it, honestly. That's most of the myths is, hey, we need this dead god to sire another kid. Okay, so from scholars looking at the New Testament as first century authentic writing, which no scholar disagrees, we have the actual papyrus. We know it was from the first century, and we know who these people were, and we know what they actually wrote down. Here are the 5 historical facts that scholars accept. Okay, no one's going to dispute. You can go to Wikipedia, talk to any scholar. These are facts of history as has been ascertained from the historical writing. Okay? And notice how these will be opposite from when you talk to just a person. If you ask a person and say, hey, what do you think historical scholars, first century scholars think about Jesus? What do you think they think about Jesus? Most people will say, well, they think he didn't exist or was a myth or wasn't alive. And this couldn't be further from the truth. Okay, the number one thing that they definitely all agree on, because there's 11 independent sources, is that Jesus died. No one disputes that. No one disputes that he was a real person, that he really existed, and he really died. Not a single scholar disputes that he was buried in a tomb. They all agree, definitely buried in a tomb. Plenty of first century authentic writing on that. Definitely the tomb was empty. Okay, for sure the tomb was empty. For sure now notice the key word in here, for sure 600 people, at least 600 people believe they saw him again. So that's what a critical scholar would say. They would say these people definitely believed it. Okay, they believe, I'm an atheist, I don't think they did, but they believed it. That's the key point. Okay, they definitely believed it. Number 5, Christianity blew up. Okay? We know this. We know this from history that Christianity blew up. So what we're going to do for the rest of our time is take a look at these 5 facts. How do we know that they're facts? And then we'll analyze the facts when we're done. So the first one I'm not going to spend any time on because when I was a kid years ago, so this would be when I first started examining this, there was some scholar people who talked about Jesus didn't really exist. Well, too many manuscripts and separate manuscripts outside of the New Testament have been found. Absolutely no one thinks that he didn't exist and didn't die anymore. So when you look at lists of facts, they just assume this. But I kept it in here because an interesting thing, in the Journal of American Medical Association, they actually published and took a look at all of the historical writings about Jesus' crucifixion, and this was in the Journal of American Medical Association. This was their medical assessment of the crucifixion. And they said death resulted primarily from and exhaustion of asphyxia. Jesus' death was ensured by the thrust of the shoulder's spear to his side. Modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when he was taken down from the cross. Okay? No scholar thinks that Jesus wasn't killed. Okay? So when you look at the facts and try to say, well, if you don't believe he rose again, he didn't really die. Nobody thinks that. Not a single scholar thinks that. The other one that I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on, because even every atheistic skeptic agrees with this, is that Jesus was buried in a tomb. And we've quoted Bart Ehrman before. He's the leading skeptic in this field. PhD from Princeton, says the gospel's central claim about Jesus as a historical figure, a Jew with followers executed on orders of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of the emperor Tiberius, are borne out by later sources. So he's saying, we've authenticated the writings in the gospel from later sources. No one disagrees that Jesus was killed and buried in a tomb. And a couple of the later sources is Josephus. He wrote a 20-volume history of the Jewish people. And Tacitus, who was Roman, wrote a Roman history around 116 AD. And both of them talk about Jesus, who was crucified during Pontius Pilate's reign. They all think this definitely happened. The next one I think is interesting is the tomb was empty. Okay, this is an interesting point because the reason we know the tomb was empty is because the Jewish governors at the time, the Jewish leaders, said the tomb was empty. And how did they say the tomb was empty? Is when they were asked about Jesus rising again, they say, hey, the disciples stole the body. So in their writings and saying the disciples stole the body, they're admitting the body's not in the tomb. Right? Because what's the simplest, quickest way to squash Christianity 5 days after the crucifixion? Just bring out the body. Right? That would be the quickest way to end this whole Christianity garbage. Okay? If they just produced the body. Hey, we know what tomb it was in. Joseph of Arimathea. We know where it is. We know there's an issue because we're going to put some Roman guards and a seal on the tomb. and we have some Christians running around saying that Jesus risen again, let's go check that tomb out, and we're going to bring his body out, and we'll prove to you that he's dead still. Okay? One thing that people don't understand is this concept of a Jewish person saying they're the Messiah wasn't uncommon. Many other men said that they were a Messiah, and they were dispatched through crucifixion similar to Jesus. Okay? The big difference is the body was gone. So the tomb was definitely empty. Another thing that is quoted on that the tomb was definitely empty is that if Christians were creating a legend, and they were like, hey, we made this whole shoot and match up, and we're going to write it down in a legendary format in the Gospels, the person they would not pick to witness the empty tomb is women. Okay? We know from Josephus' writings that women were not allowed to testify at that time in the court of law. Okay? Their testimony was deemed unreliable. So if you were inventing a religion, the people you would not pick to be the witnesses to the main point, the empty tomb, you wouldn't choose women to be the main witnesses if you were making it up. Why are the women the witnesses? Because that's what's happened. And they recorded truthfully what happened. And last week we talked about other second century gospels and how they are legendary, if you were here last week. For example, a second century gospel that isn't included because it comes off as legend is the gospel of Philip. In Philip's gospel, on the third day, all of the Jewish Sanhedrin were there. All of the Roman soldiers were there. They're all witnessing it. 2 people came down, entered the tomb, the stone rolled away, 3 people exited. All of a sudden, they're giant, their heads are touching the clouds, and behind them, the cross floats out behind them. That is what a legend looks like. That's what happens 200 years after the event, is you have writings that have embellished and turned it into a legend. In the Gospels, we don't have that. We have a very matter-of-fact accounting. These people went to this place and saw this thing. I included this meme because this is something near and dear to me. I am person B and my wife is person A. So we definitely have had to develop a system for filling up the car with gas because if the light is on for me, that means I have more time. And if the light is on for her, that means panic. So we look at 600 plus people believe they saw Jesus alive. Okay? So we talked about how do we know this is true? How do scholars come to the realization that this is a historical fact? Is that the earliest historical writings list people who saw Jesus alive, and we just looked at that. Okay? So the earliest writings don't just say Jesus appeared to a couple people. They actually list people out. Okay? At the beginning of Luke says, hey, I went and interviewed a whole bunch of people, and if you want to go talk to them, you're more than go talk to them. Okay? Not a single New Testament account says just believe it because I said so. They all are quoting their eyewitnesses. Next is what happened after they saw him. Okay? So people who saw him totally changed, did an about-face 180. Okay, we have James, the brother of Jesus. The New Testament tells us that at one point, Jesus' family thought he was bonkers. They thought he was beside himself. They said, you need to come out of there, and we need to talk to you. We need to have a serious intervention. Okay? So James, the brother of Jesus, was not an early Christian. Okay? He witnessed the risen Jesus. So what would it take for you, those of you who has a brother, who actually has a brother? So if you have a brother, this is easier to think about, but what would it take for you to believe that your brother is the Son of God and is the Messiah? Okay? For me, I think it would take me seeing him rise from the dead. Okay, and that's what happened for James. He totally did a 180. Saul/Paul. He went from having a mandate from the Jewish government to hunt out and kill Christians to totally turning around. 100% change. His complete worldview changed. He went from thinking we need to be sacrificing these animals and that's how I atone for my sin to I don't need to be doing that anymore. Okay, everything about his worldview changed. The animals he could eat, the animals he couldn't eat. How he thought about his God totally changed. His entire worldview changed. Why did that happen? And we have Peter. The New Testament tells us that Peter was scared out of his wits. And why was he scared? Because Jews thought the Messiah was going to come and kick some total butt. Okay? You said you're the Messiah. You're doing some sweet, sweet healing. I'm all for that. When the rubber hits the road and these Romans are going to take you, there are oppressors. You're going to do some, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Superman stuff on them. You are definitely not going to die. Okay? And as soon as he died, Peter and the other disciples ran scared. They're like, we're next. He's not the Messiah. We got to pull the plug on this thing. I got to go back to fishing. But something changed. Peter totally changed his life. So we have an atheist scholar, Dr. GERD Ludemann. This is from his book. It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. This is a skeptic. This is a skeptic looking at the historical evidence and says, these people definitely believe they saw Christ. Definitely. The final thing is that Christianity exploded. And what do we mean by that? One great example is just looking at the dates. So in 27 AD, there was absolutely no Christians on the planet. Okay? We know Christ, his ministry was approximately 3 years. If we say he died in 30, we know at 27, 0 Christians. Nobody in the world. By 112 AD, the Roman governor in Turkey, and we have the letter, and we actually have the emperor's response, wrote a letter and basically said, what should we do with all these Christians? Okay, and in his letter, he details how he's interrogating them, how he's killing them, how he's pardoning them. He's saying, should we treat people who are younger different than older? Okay, he details, and one thing that's interesting is in his letter, they don't actually talk about what the crime is. They don't say the crime. The crime is just assumed that the crime is they aren't worshiping the Roman gods. Okay? So he actually goes through and says, this is how I've been pardoning Christians. Okay? We pull them in. We give them 3 chances to denounce Christianity. And if they do, they have to repeat a prayer to the Roman God after I talk. So it's repeat after me kind of thing. Okay, you're not a Christian? Repeat after me. And he gives them something to say, and they have to repeat it. And then they would pardon them. And the reason they're pardoning them is, in his letter, he says, because a true Christian would never admit to this, would never go against. If you were a true believer, you wouldn't change your mind. Okay? And they even have Trajan's response. Okay, one of the interesting things in Trajan's response, since Rome was a conquering entity, is he said, hey, don't go out and hunt the Christians. Okay, don't go hunt them because we don't want to appear as the authority is inquisiting and going out and looking for problems. If they're brought to you, handle them the way you had talked about. Okay, so don't go out hunting for them, but if they come. One of the things that the governor asked was, should I accept anonymous reports? Okay, hey, Dave here is a Christian. Who reported it? We don't know. And the emperor said, no, you should not accept anonymous reports. Okay, if a named person is making a claim, then you can follow your procedure. Okay, so we have the emperor of quite possibly the largest organized government in the history of our world in less than 100 years has to deal with Christianity. Okay, and we're not talking, this isn't the governor of Jerusalem. This is the governor of Turkey who's saying, we have so many Christians. Okay? One of the things the governor of Turkey found interesting is that Christians profess not to commit any crime. They don't profess not to commit the big bad ones. Part of their creed is not to commit any crime. That's weird. That was interesting to him, and he wrote that to the emperor. And we have the letter. Peter goes from scared to church leader. We talked about that. Saul goes from killing Christians to church leader. James goes from thinking Jesus is crazy to a church leader. And they died for Christianity. Okay? When I was looking at this in my early 20s, this concept was the thing that pushed me over the edge. Okay? Now, at the time, we didn't have 9/11, so like hardcore martyrs weren't something that was part of the psyche, but this was still something that when you look at it is kind of mind-boggling. So the apostles were in a unique position in history. Okay, unique in that they knew for a fact if it was true or not true. Us here in this room are doing it on belief. We're analyzing the data, we're looking at the data, and then we have to decide for ourselves, is this true or not true? Am I going to believe? And part of that mechanism for belief is a one-on-one personal experience with Christ. And once you have that, that pushes you over the edge. But we're still doing it on belief. These apostles had a unique position where it wasn't belief for them. Okay? Is it belief that I'm standing here for any of you? Would you call that belief? No, it's not belief. You're not taking it on faith. You're seeing it with your own eyes. So we have a group of people who weren't taking it on belief, who saw it with their own eyes, and were asked. Now, I'll have to give a caveat. Some of these reports of how they died are loosely attested. So we have the New Testament, which is insanely attested, 5,000 early manuscripts. The number of manuscripts is mind-boggling. Some of these reports are very loose, are one side mention. Okay, so that's not the point. The point is that we knew the main ones. For example, we know Peter. For example, James, Jesus' brother, he was thrown off a cliff. He wasn't dead, so they actually started stoning him, and then a guy came up and whacked him with a stick to finish him off. That is attested in multiple separate history documents. So that one's really well attested. So some of these are really well attested. But the concept is, would you die for something you knew was a lie? We definitely know people who would die for something they believe. Okay? The two most common things are to die for religion because you believe in it, or die for politics, your country, because you believe in your country. But would you die for a lie? Okay? And we know what was proposed to them. Okay? The governor in Turkey laid out, hey, this is how us as Romans are going to handle this. We're going to give them 3 chances to denounce it, then we're taking them down. And in the letter, he was like, do I have to crucify all of them? Or can we just kill them? Okay? So the thing that pushed me over the edge was these people were the ones to know. Who would know for 100%? Because that's what I was doing as a college kid. I was like, I need to know for 100%. That was my original goal. How can I know for 100%? Well, there's no way you can. We're 2,000 years removed from the event. There's no way you can know for 100%. But when we look at this, these were people who could know for 100%. And how did they act? How did they react? Okay, they traveled the world, told everybody that they could, and were unwavering. I have Paul here at the end, and Paul, he gave his list at one point in the New Testament. He said that he took 39 lashings 5 different times. He was beat with a stick 3 different times. He was stoned, shipwrecked 3 different times. And then finally, this was one that is well attested. He was beheaded in Rome by orders of Nero in approximately 66 AD. Now, one interesting totally sidetrack is you see a lot of them died before 70 AD. What we know as a fact of history is that Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. And so that's one of the reasons why historians know that none of the New Testament mentions that Jerusalem would fall, that Jerusalem fell in 70 AD. Well, why is that a big deal? Well, because Jesus predicted it. Jesus predicted, hey, Jerusalem will fall before the end of a generation. And he was right. So don't you think if the person you say is the Messiah made a prediction that came true, you'd pop that into your writings? And none of them did. And that's one of the historical reasons why we know, hey, they probably all wrote this before 70 AD. And we know that a lot of them died before then. So the question that we have to look at isn't what are the facts? The scholars all agree. Whether you're atheist, agnostic, Jew, Christian, it doesn't matter. Across the board, these are the facts of history. That Jesus died, that he was buried, the tomb was empty, 600 people believed they saw him again, and Christianity blew up. So let's look at some of the possible explanations.
It's a matter of historical record that Jesus of Nazareth died and his body was placed in a tomb. It's also been firmly established that after his death and burial, his tomb was found empty. Various individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive, and his disciples somehow became absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. These are the historical facts. How do you explain them? Down through history, various naturalistic explanations have been offered to explain away these facts. Let's examine the 4 most popular ones. First, the conspiracy theory. According to this view, the disciples faked the resurrection. They stole Jesus' body from the tomb and then lied about seeing Jesus alive, thereby perpetrating the greatest hoax of all time. However, this theory faces overwhelming objections. It's hopelessly anachronistic. It looks at the disciples' situation through the rear-view mirror of Christian history, instead of from the standpoint of a first-century Jew. Jews had no concept of a Messiah who would be defeated and executed by Israel's enemies, much less rise from the dead. In Jewish thinking, the resurrection of the dead was a general event that takes place only after the end of the world and has no connection at all with the Messiah. The conspiracy theory also fails to address the disciples' obvious sincerity. People don't willingly die for something they know is not true. An honest reading of the New Testament makes it clear. These people sincerely believed the message they proclaimed and were willing to die for. For these and other reasons, no scholar defends the conspiracy theory today. A second attempt to explain the facts is the apparent death theory. Jesus didn't really die. He revived in the tomb, somehow escaped, and managed to convince his disciples he was risen from the dead. This theory also faces insurmountable obstacles. First, it's medically impossible. The Roman executioners were professionals. They knew what they were doing and made sure their victims were dead before taken down. Moreover, Jesus was tortured so extensively that even if he was taken down alive, he would have died in the sealed tomb. Second, this theory is wildly implausible. Seeing a half-dead man who crawled out of the tomb, desperately in need of bandaging and medical attention, would hardly have convinced the disciples that he was gloriously risen from the dead. As a result, no New Testament historians defend this theory today. A third explanation is the displaced body theory. Perhaps Joseph of Arimathea placed Jesus' body in his tomb temporarily because it was convenient, but later he moved the corpse to a criminal's common graveyard. So, when the disciples visited the first tomb and found it empty, they concluded that Jesus must have risen from the dead. Once again, this theory cannot make sense of the facts. Jewish laws prohibited moving a corpse after it was interred, except to the family tomb. What's more, the criminal's graveyard was located close to the place of execution, so that burial there would not have been a problem. Also, once the disciples began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection, Joseph would have corrected their mistake. So, once again, no current scholars endorse this theory. Finally, the hallucination theory. The disciples didn't really see Jesus, but just imagined that he appeared before them. They were all hallucinating. This theory also faces considerable problems. First, Jesus appeared not just one time, but many times. Not just in one place, but in different places. Not just to one person, but to different persons. Not just to individuals, but to groups of people. And not just to believers, but to unbelievers as well. There is nothing in the psychological casebooks on hallucinations comparable to these resurrection appearances. Second, hallucinations of Jesus would have led the disciples to believe at most that Jesus had been transported to heaven, not risen from the dead, in contradiction to their Jewish beliefs. Moreover, in the ancient world, visions of the deceased were not evidence that the person was alive, but evidence that he was dead and had moved on to the afterworld. Finally, this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Thus, the four most popular naturalistic theories fail to explain the historical facts. Where does that leave us? Another possibility is the explanation given by the original eyewitnesses that God raised Jesus from the dead. Unlike the other theories, this makes perfect sense of the empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus alive, and the disciples' willingness to die for their belief. But is this explanation plausible? After all, it requires a miracle, a supernatural act of God. Think about it. If it's even possible that God exists, then miracles are possible, and this explanation cannot be ruled out. And surely it's possible that God exists. So how do you explain the resurrection?
So those were the leading theories over time because they had to explain it. If we had to explain these things that we know are true, how are you going to explain it? And that's something that you can talk to skeptic friends about, neighbors, loved ones. Okay, if you don't believe it, how do you explain these things? What's your explanation? Now, because these 5 facts are so widely attested and so agreed upon in the scholarship, that debates on this topic are almost non-existent because they end up being crazy. And here's one example.
Critic in a rather awkward situation. For example, I had a debate a few years ago with a professor at the University of California, Irvine, on the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this man had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection, and he was thoroughly familiar with the facts. He could not deny the facts of Jesus' burial in the tomb, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And so, his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of those 4 facts. And so, he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him just after birth, grew up independently somewhere, came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole his brother's body out of the tomb, and presented himself to the disciples who mistakenly thought it was Jesus risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this hypothesis, but I think that the example is instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
So that's where we are right now with skepticism at the professional scholarship level, okay? Because no scholar disputes any of these facts. The only dispute is the explanation of the facts. And the best analogy I heard for this is where someone is not married and their friends, meet a girl and say, you know what, this girl would be perfect for this guy. Let's set them up on a blind date. And the people get set up on a blind date, and the guy meets her, and they hit it off, and she's great. And after the date, he talks to his friends, and his friends are like, didn't she tick all the boxes? You thought she was good looking, she was great personality, you got along great, everything was awesome, all the facts line up. And the guy says, yep, okay. And he's like, yeah, but I don't want to be married. That's what we have here. The facts line up. Just, you don't want to believe. You choose and make a choice and say, nope, I don't want it. I don't want what he's offering. And it's the lie of freedom. Hey, I want to be free to do what I want to do. But the truth is, those freedoms only lead to death as opposed to light. So here's the common thing, is I explain that the Bible is true because that's what it says in the Bible. Okay? And this is what people think. But this isn't what scholars do. They talk about what's in the Bible because it's a first century authenticated writing. We know who wrote it, when they wrote it, and they were at a unique position in history to know what was true or not true. Okay? So nobody with a PhD throws out the Bible. Okay, just because it's bound and put together means we should throw it out? Why do you think it was bound and put together? Because it was the best writing. People in first century collected the best writings and said, hey, these are the best, we should save them. That's why we have them. Okay? Now, the interesting thing to consider is people say, well, you want me to be a Christian because the Bible says so. Okay? Well, consider this. The Bible didn't create any Christians. Okay? I showed from the timeline that Paul became a Christian, what we would call a Christian, roughly in 32 AD. Okay? There was nothing written down in 32 AD. The Bible did not exist in 32 AD. Okay? The early Christians did not become Christian because the Bible said so. And so when I talk to high schoolers about this, I ask them, why are you a Christian? Why are you a Christian? Why are you a Christian? Well, my mom says I should. Well, that's not a good reason. So if we look back at the first century Christians, why were they Christians? Because something happened. Something happened in history. An event created Christianity, not the Bible. And we have this weird twisted view that the Bible creates Christians. No, it doesn't. An event creates Christians. So the last thing and I'm going to talk about is miracles. And this is the final hang-up that people have. Okay, I see the facts. I see your 5 facts. I concede them. Yes, I look. Those are true. But I just can't get over the miracle thing. Okay, miracles just don't happen. And so this guy, Dr. Craig S. Keener, wrote this book on miracles. And the book is crazy boring. And if you look at it, the top part is the book, and the bottom part of each page is his references. And the book, he just goes through, and if you read the table of contents just says, it's so interesting. He just goes over and says, examples from Asia, examples from the Philippines, examples from Southwest Asia, examples from India, examples from Sri Lanka, examples from Indonesia, examples from South Korea. He just is cataloging them all. Oh yeah, I forgot, it's 2 volumes. Yeah, I couldn't read them all. You can just whip open to any page, and all he's doing is attesting. He's saying, hey, I investigated this miracle. These are what the people said. This is what the doctor said. I investigated this miracle. This is what they said. This is what the doctor said. I investigated this miracle. I investigated this miracle. I investigated this miracle. And he's got them categorized by type of miracle, like limbs growing back, getting of sight, sick tummies being healed. And he just investigates the miracles. And this isn't like some crackpot. This is a PhD at Duke. And he just said, hey, I'm tired of you guys saying we got to throw out because there's miracles. People see miracles all the time, okay? It's not growing on trees, but there's enough of them, and they're widely attested. So he dedicated years of his life just to finding out these miracles. Now, I bought his book just to give him some money, not because I was going to read them all, but if you want to, you can basically flip to any page, and he goes through, there's whole sections where he's talking about where he got his reference material, because this is intended to be a scholarly work. This isn't like a fun read. He didn't intend it for that. Now, if I can pull up volume 2, starting right here to the end is his bibliography. Okay? So this wasn't somebody who just did this willy-nilly and said, hey, let's get a few people to talk about it. He's documented everything, and what I challenge people is, if you ask around and ask people will agree, like, hey, it's less than the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? You know somebody who has seen something miraculous, okay? So when someone has that as their main thing, they're really on their last rope. When they say, well, I just don't believe in miracles, okay? Well, that's something you can't disprove 100%, okay? And all you have to do is ask around. So if I can present to you one person who said it happened, is that what's going to take for you to believe? What is it going to take? And really what it comes down to is the emotional side of it, is I need to accept the concept that I'm not going to decide right and wrong for myself, that I'm going to allow this offering of theology to decide right and wrong for me because it's a third-party morale system. And instead of just saying, yes, I accept this third-party morale system, he's going to prove it to me. He's going to say, don't just take my word for it. What's easier to say, your sins are forgiven or rise and walk? I'm going to give you some proof. And then it was well documented. So what's the most rational worldview? So what we've done in these 6 weeks is we've attempted to look at a worldview from 5 different angles, okay? So the first angle we looked at was logic, okay? If someone talks to you and says, well, I just don't think it's reasonable, or it just doesn't make sense, or, I don't see, that doesn't work out in my mind, okay? Those are logical concepts, okay? So we talked about how there's ironclad, undeniable proof for God's existence that even the top atheists don't deny, okay? That it's just a proof. So we looked at science. If someone is a nerd and says, well, science, and the most common thing that I hear is that, well, the Big Bang disproves God. The scientists who discovered the Big Bang knew that it proved God, and that's why it made them mad, okay? They knew once the universe had a beginning, something had to cause it to begin, okay? And we looked at the fingerprints of intelligent design on everything down to molecular machines. Next, we looked at the theology, okay? We looked at other religions and said, okay, if God is there's definitely a God, for sure. How am I going to reconcile that? How am I going to connect with God? And what's the best theology to do that in? And we looked And we noticed how Christianity had something totally radically different than every other religion on the planet. It is not a merit-based system. It's not merit badges. It's not I do good and therefore I get good in return. It's he saved me first. He saved me first. So the theology of Christianity is totally unique and offers something that nothing else offers. And actually, in what it offers, it makes it easier for us. It's the easiest one. It's the easiest one for us to do. Why wouldn't we pick the easiest one? We also looked at history and said it is the most well-documented religion on the planet. It has the closest writings to the original. It's not dependent on one person. Okay, we don't just have one person. We don't just have Joseph Smith saying, trust me, there was gold tablets, pinky swear. Okay? We have the actual manuscript evidence of what was written and what was said that we can look back on. And we have historical evidence outside of what was gathered together in the Bible. And we talked about how who cares that it's bound in the Bible. It was just the best ones, so we bundled them together. But there's Roman and Jewish historians that attest to the historicity of Jesus. And finally, we looked at the facts of the resurrection. Okay? We said, here are 5 facts. How are you going to reconcile those? How are you going to sort them out in your mind? What is the best explanation for what happened? Okay? And again, Christianity isn't based on a holy book. Okay? It's based on an event that happened. So what can you do now? What's next now that we've finished this class? So I've gone over ad nauseum what the goal was of the classes. And I've changed this a little bit. So the goal was to give youth a specific worldview. But now that we've gone through this, I hope you feel empowered, okay, as a young person, middle school, high school, college age, that you can talk to your classmates, that you know how to talk to them. Okay, you don't talk down, you ask questions, get them to think. Okay, and you know specific topics that you can bring up and you can talk about. Okay. We've empowered all of us to use the tactics to speak with not just for the youth, but for all of us. That if the next time you're in the break room and something comes up, you know how to talk and what to talk about. Okay? And the things that we brought up, you just Google. This isn't super secret. Okay? And finally, we've empowered you to be ready in any situation to ask the right questions that lead to Christ. That says, how do you reconcile the 5 historic facts? Okay? How do you reconcile the theology? How do you reconcile the science? Okay? If God doesn't exist, then what started the Big Bang? What started it? Answer that. What started it? Finally, I have resources here for this specific class, this one. And you've seen from the other classes that we have resources on all of them for all of the classes at the end. So these were the specific resources I used for this class. The 2 really good books are The Sun Rises by William Lane Craig and The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. The other book that I didn't put on here that I should have is The Case for Christ. Some of you have seen that documentary and that drama movie. Lee Strobel does a really good job talking about what he did. And he did something similar to what I did and investigated it and said, okay, I need to look at it. But I would say there's these 2 videos here. Each one is about an hour long, and they do a really, really good job of outlining these 5 facts, of giving you really good evidence and going through them. So I know they're kind of in long format, but they're really good. And finally, I want to leave you, before we open up for questions, with this concept. This is the concept that I think is lost, that we forget as everyday Christians. I mean, I would count myself as an everyday Christian. I'm not at the beginning. I'm not in that honeymoon phase. I'm in the grind every day. And sometimes in the grind every day, it's easy to lose sight of how important this is. Okay, and C.S. Lewis, I think, said it best, that Christianity, if false, is of no importance. And Paul would agree with him. Paul wrote that in 1 Corinthians. He agreed. If it's false, it doesn't matter. And if it's true, it's of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So it can't be in the middle. Either it's definitely true or definitely false. It can't be in the middle.